My name is Kathleen Massey, and I'm the new president of the Groningen Declaration Network, and I'd like to welcome you to the GDN's new webinar series. I'm so pleased that you have decided to participate in the GDN by attending today's webinar. Your involvement is critical to the success of the network. The GDN is a global organization that brings together people and organizations who are committed to making it possible and easy for people worldwide to consult and share their authentic educational data with whomever they want, whenever they want, wherever they are. Today you are joining thought leaders from across the world to pave the way for this to be done well, equitably, and by developing trusted networks and using contemporary secure technology. I invite you to continue your involvement in the GDN by attending additional webinars and by joining us at our next.
Good morning, everyone. It's great to have you join us. My name is Joanne Duclis, and I will be the moderator today along with Rick Torres. I'm just going to take a moment and share our slide deck, and then we will be underway. Today's session is called The Art of the Possible, Creating Sustainable Interoperability Through Collaboration. We have with us a game plan for doing a little bit of an introduction. We're going to do some context setting with the good help of our colleague Rick Torres. We'll have a panel discussion and roundtable and closing, bringing it back, shall we say. We look forward to lots of good discussion with all of you. So today, joining us, I'm going to ask each of my colleagues to introduce themselves, starting with Ramesh Vadivel. Go ahead, Ramesh.
Hey everyone, Ramesh Vadivel from McGill University in Montreal, Canada. I'm also the president of ARUC, our National Association in Canada of Registrars at Universities and Colleges here.
Melanie?
I'm Melanie Gottlieb. I'm the Deputy Director of ACRO, which is the American Association of Collegiate Registrars and Admission Officers, and I'm also a member of the Groningen Declaration Board of Directors.
Francisco?
Good morning. Hello to everyone. I'm Francisco Maldonado. I'm the president of the board of ARCI, which is the Association of Mexican Registrars and Student Services Officers, and I'm in the GDN board also. Good morning.
And Rick?
Good morning, everyone. I hope you're all safe and healthy. My name is Rick Torres, the CEO of the National Student Clearinghouse, who are also very proudly one of the founders of the Groningen Declaration Network.
And as I said, I'm Joanne Duclis. I have my own consulting and research firm here in Canada. I'm here today as a result of being an executive lead for the ARUC National Network, and also because I support the Groningen Declaration Network. So without further ado, I'm going to hand it over to Rick Torres to give us a little bit of context setting as we move into discussing sustainable interoperability.
Thanks, Joanne, and welcome everyone again. You know, embracing and building off of the path created by initiatives like RS3G and the digital student data portability movements, the Groningen Declaration Network has been championing the establishment of networks of organizations who are looking to work together and learn from each other so that globally, lifelong learners, educators, and industry can benefit from the establishment of interoperable frameworks. As we have seen and experienced, to achieve full interoperability, there are foundational elements that need to be in place both domestically within a nation's borders to better serve its own citizens, and then the effort needs to be made to translate and build the baseline elements essential for cross-border portability. We've seen examples of this in Europe with ELMO, MREX, Erasmus Without Papers, Australasia, including HES, and then Japan and China and India, and now in North America. I've been engaged in this process since 2008, and since joining the Clearinghouse, and have extended our desire to enable this globally through joining the GDN as a founder. The Groningen Declaration Network has been effective at bringing these transforming and enabling global organizations together. At a high level, I assess there are three main foundational pillars that have to be addressed for full interoperability to be a reality. And they include ensuring that learners' learning networks are embracing digital outputs, comprehensive learner records, XML transcripts, to record the progress and achievement of their learners. Today in the United States, 15 to 20% of transcripts are still paper-based. Second, that the technology and standards required to enable true future interoperability between education and employers and learners are in place. And finally, that policies supporting the educational components of lifelong learning, academic and workplace-based, including skill-based learning, data portability policies and privacy policies are all pointing to a future that supports full skill and learning progression interoperability without compromising privacy and security. It is great to have representatives from ACRO, Uruk, and RC here to discuss their proactive approaches in moving their nations toward interoperability internally and internationally. Joanne, back to you.
So folks, what we want to do today is walk through some discussion questions. And I'm going to show you our roadmap, but we honestly are not limited to this. We're asking all of you to think about the kind of questions that you have, and please do use the chat, not the Q&A, so that we can make sure that we are watching and gaining from the intellectual power that's at the table today. So as you can see before you, these are some of the discussion questions I'm going to be walking our panelists through, and we welcome your engagement. One of the things that is really important in all of this is to recognize how different we are, and yet also acknowledge where there's some wonderful similarities. So I'm going to turn the first question over to Francisco from Mexico to give us a flavor of his context in his region, as well as what his thoughts are about some of the diversity and similarity he sees across regions to help us get our minds in the right place. Go ahead, Francisco.
Thank you, Joanne. Well, everyone, good morning again. As we can see here in this chart, our three countries are very different. By the way, the last column is European Union, our data from European Union. And you can see here how different we are in so many aspects that are directly related with education. So while, for example, my country, Mexico, is spending, as a percentage of public spending, the most elevated percentage, 19%, more than USA and maybe more than Canada, because I see a billion, not percentage. Nevertheless, our country is less developed in education, especially in tertiary education or higher education. The public spending of our country on tertiary education is 18% about public spending in education. So only the fifth of the all spending of the government in education, only this fifth, almost a fifth part, is for higher education. And here in this percentage, we're talking about everything. We're talking about the salaries of the teachers. We're talking about infrastructure. We're talking about technology. We're talking about everything. So our resources as country in this matter are very, very limited in compared with some other regions or specific countries like USA or Canada, or for instance, the European Union. That's a first point I want to pull up, Joanne.
And Francisco, let me ask you something. My sense of Mexico is it's quite it's governed in quite a diverse way, in the sense that do you not have many states involved in this area?
Yes, we have the federal government and then 32 states with different governments. Some of them are close to the federal government, same party, same vision of country, but maybe the other half of them are from a different party, a different vision of the country, different vision of education, and that is complex for us. Actually, I have another comments about it in a few minutes. If you
Yes, and do you also find that, is there a lot of private schools versus public, or the opposite?
Actually, yes, we have a lot of private institutions, but these private institutions have only the 30% of the enrollment, of the global enrollment in the country, and a minor amount of public institutions have the greater or the great enrollment of the country. It's a very different educational system, maybe, compared with USA and Canada.
So that's actually a nice segue over to Melanie to give us a little bit of flavor about the American context.
Sure. And really just reflecting on the numbers, it's quite clear the US spends quite a lot on education. But we have a similar challenge as Francisco, in that we have 50 states and a federal government that is less involved in education than the states are. We're also, from a contextual level, in a place where our education spending has been decreasing over the past decade or so, and clearly will, at least in what we can see looking ahead, will continue to decrease. So we spend a good deal on education. We have a lot of resources for that spending, but perhaps it is not coordinated at the national level in the way that other countries might think about it.
And would you say, Melanie, that there's a tremendous governance diversity, legislative diversity, type of institutional diversity? It seems like diversity is the theme for you, yes?
Yes, decentralization and diversity is absolutely the theme in the US in terms of how we approach education.
Interesting. Ramesh, what about you? Give us a flavor of Canada.
Sure. Well, as you can see, Canada, no surprise, is a much smaller region or country than the other two. That said, we're a knowledge economy and pride ourselves on that. Education tends to be a public good. Our tertiary education, and specifically at the university and college level, this tends to be publicly funded. So there's a great deal of importance that's placed on education writ large. And of course, the tension, and it's a growing tension over the past few years, is that we have an aging population. So the number of college or university age individuals is also on the decline. We pride ourselves on being able to attract students from around the world, and this shows in the level of spending that we incur and the level of importance that we place on education. I will say, much like what you've heard for the United States, in Canada, higher education is not necessarily a federal mandate. The individual provinces, of which there are 10, have their own specific and deliberate mandates for funding and sustaining higher education and providing that to our learners. So the individual strategies are just that. There is an overarching national level strategy with regard to promoting Canadian educational opportunities abroad, but where the rubber hits the road is at the provincial level, by and large.
So when I think about all this diversity that each of you described, which seems to be how you're quite similar, if you have quite diverse political scaffolding, governance scaffolding, policy scaffolding, what's the secret ingredient that any of you focus on when you're trying to build collaboration in order to create sustainable interoperability? Anybody want to take a shot at that?
My only comment on that front before sort of ceding to my colleagues is adaptability and agility. We have enough on our plates at the best of times. We have to recognize that there are differences, focus on the commonalities, and build out the conversation from there. And that implies that we should be adaptable and agile enough to move in the direction to be all-encompassing within the constraints of those collaborations.
Melanie, did you want to comment?
Yeah, I would just say that within the US context, I think a lot of the movement forward does happen in collaborative groups across sectors. And so we look at workforce sectors, we look at association and nonprofit sectors, we look at some government sectors, states, but it really has to be a collaborative effort in order to move anything forward, because we don't, frankly, have a national strategy on education.
Francisco, did you want to add anything? And Rick, I may ask you to jump in here.
Yes, Joanne, thank you. I just want to add that behind all of these numbers, big and real different numbers, there are people, there are individuals with same dreams, with same aspirations in our three countries. Despite our governments, our rules, our policies, our technology, there are people, similar people with same dreams, same aspirations. So I think we have this in common: people with aspirations, with these dreams and this drive for development, for self-development.
Yes. You know, Francisco, I love you bring that theme in. We are about doing this for our learners and for helping them achieve their dreams. Rick, did you want to add anything to this point before we move to the next section?
Sure. I think one of the most important pieces is to get aligned around the what. Okay, what is it that we're trying to accomplish? And that what needs to be answered by anyone that you're bringing into a collaborative effort. And then what are the common denominators that you all have, building off of Romesh's comments, right? You need to identify the common denominators, because those become the building blocks, right? Because there's going to be lots of differences. And if you start, as we've learned in the US and are experiencing, if you start at the fringe, you'll never get to agreement in the middle, right? So you really have to start with places that are in common, where there's a common objective, a common theme, and then build off of that. And eventually you'll take care of a lot of it. But I think, frankly, the clearinghouse was founded on that basis. Not everybody agreed on everything. It didn't satisfy everybody, but everybody agreed on the context, and, you know, so far so good. And I think that's a good example of how it can come together.
Yeah, and it's interesting when you say that. Romesh will know this. The piece about principles, establishing common agreement around principles sometimes can help you through the sticky times. Would you say, Romesh?
100%, yes.
So what we want to do now is we kind of want to explore a little bit of a different space with all of you. I think it's really important to understand, what are you doing currently to help create sustainable interoperability, even within your borders, given that diverse context. And we talked a little bit about the collaboration piece, finding common ground, common principles. But let's get real here for a second. And Francisco, I want you to walk us through some of what's going on with digitization, policy, technology, and standards in Mexico, just to help square us in our mind's eye. And
Sure, I'm sorry, I was muted. Do you hear me now?
We can hear you. Go ahead.
Okay, thank you. Well, here you can see an image about our process since last 2018. I mean, we just have 2 years working like this about digital credentials in Mexico, but it's important to note that everything in Mexico is regulated by the educational authorities, I mean the government, both federal and state, including the types, characteristics, and standards of academic credentials. As you can see here, the like XML standard. And both for both public and private institutions, since all graduates must obtain a professional license, what you can see in the bottom of the image, which is necessary or mandatory to practice their profession in the country. So they have to get this professional license, which authorizes them, the graduates, to practice their profession throughout the country. And this license is issued only by the Secretary of Public Education. We have an agency, as you can see on the left bottom, with the mission of issue this professional license, so graduates can practice their profession all over the country. And this license will not be issued if the registered diploma that the diploma that university issued that had to be registered in this agency does not meet with the requirements and standards they have set, XML standard, as I said, so that the institution can do, so that no institution, sorry, can do anything different to this if they want to comply with the law, so that their graduates can obtain a professional license. Some institutions, besides complying with what the government has established, have gone a little further and are already issuing their graduates their diploma in the blockchain standard, which, in addition to reinforcing the security of their data, can be useful to them in some other country or for some other purpose other than the required by the Mexican government. In view of this generalized and an obligatory scheme for the whole country, both for undergraduate and graduate studies, RC, our association, has played an important role as liaison and consultant between the educational authority and the institutions in order to achieve a possible scheme feasible, but at the same time sufficiently safe and as agile as possible, considering the reality of institutions, their economic, technological, and human resources, and the needs of the students. Otherwise, the regulations for electronic credentials issued by the government could have been far removed from something that was possible for the institutions and or useless for the graduates. Some RC member institutions participated in the pilot tests of this system, and as I said before, started only 2 years ago, and some of their IT teams supported government authorities in developing this system. Basically, you can see here when the student finish their his program or her program, the diploma, the university issues the diploma in XML standard, both transcript and diploma, by the way, and send it both to the education authority. So this education authority, bottom right, the education authority authenticate these documents and return them to the university. The institution send them to the student. So the student now have their credentials. And then the institution sent only the diploma, the authenticated diploma, to the government agency of licensing. And this agency just stored this diploma, and the student or the graduate have to go into this system and self-generate, self-issue his own or her own professional license in the same XML standard, and the student can download it or copy or print this license. So at the end, as you can see, the student can have their 3 credentials: transcript, diploma, and professional license, the 3 of them in XML standard, but with PDF representations. And at they are accessible at their cell phone or in the cloud or wherever the student wants to have their credentials. Basically, this is how we are working since 2 years ago.
So Francisco, I have a follow-up question, because the piece about sustainable interoperability talks a little bit about collaboration, policy, and people. You created this in the last 2 years. Is everybody on board? Is the particular institutions on board?
Yes, we had some, obviously RC was on board, and other associations of institutions, and some of our members were in the pilot tests of this standard, and we had to be very close to the authority and their IT teams, because they could develop something very, or too, I don't know how to say, too
Closed?
good, too professional.
Too good? Too professional?
Yes, but not at the reach of institutions. I mean, institutions
accessible.
in Mexico, yes, acceptable. Institutions
Yes.
in Mexico, as in United States and maybe Canada, are very different. We have
Yes.
big public institutions with more than 200,000 students, but we have very small institutions with maybe 500 students, with so little resources in technology, economics, and so. So the government has to develop something feasible, something possible for everyone. So
Yes,
actually,
interesting.
yes, big institutions with great resources and RC and other associations were participating with the government in the development of this
Oh,
model.
very nice. So we're going to return back to this, Francisco. I just want to give Melanie a chance and Ramesh a chance to quickly give an overview of their systems. Ramesh, why don't you go first?
Sure. Well, I certainly won't do a history lesson here, but we do have a bit of a chronology of certain key events over the last 50 or so years pertaining to Canadian higher education. Uruk, of course, featuring on the far left, where we were conceived and established in 1964, incorporated actually as of 2018. Uruk is a member-driven institution and organization, so we represent the interests of the higher ed community, specifically in the registrarial community, for all of our member institutions, of which there are roughly 200. And that represents the vast majority of the higher educational institutions across the country. You can see, according to the chronology, there are a number of sort of pivotal points that occurred throughout the last 50 years. Typically, implementations at the provincial level, fairly foundational though, if you consider right in the middle of the slide in the 90s, the provincial hubs basically created in a number of provinces, notably Ontario and British Columbia. Application centers, of course, commenced interestingly back in the 1970s with the Ontario University Application Center's inception. And then all the way to the right-hand side, where we can see not only standards, research, and consultation, and the ratification of the Lisbon Recognition Convention, which is an extremely important document and convention to which Canada, after 20 years of deliberation at the provincial level, managed to ratify. We get to where we are now in 2020, where the national network essentially has been founded, is in place, and is in the process of being populated. All of this, in my mind, is really illustrative of a conversation and an evolution, and the two go hand in hand. Francisco hit the nail on the head with regard to a focus on people. The people obviously are making the difference. People are championing things and moving things forward, moving a national discussion forward. But one element I think that I should focus on here that isn't necessarily highlighted is in the Canadian context. If we're talking about individual provinces doing different things, implementing hubs or application centers and competency and capacity, they're also doing so not in a vacuum, but where other research and consultation is also taking place. And notably, a document which was basically published in 2015, collaboratively between Uruk and PCCAT, which is our Pan-Canadian Consortium on Admissions and Transfer, with the incredible assistance of Joanne, actually, in this particular initiative, the Uruk PCCAT Transcript and Transfer Guide. It's not enough to talk about collaboration and have in mind a particular future state. You need to have the language under you to be able to discern what you are talking about, so that you can then build out the functional pieces regarding data transfer and exchange. And so that transcript guide itself basically synthesized hundreds upon hundreds of different terms and terminologies, standards, and so forth that are in place and in practice now at institutions across the country. And from there, the conversation about what a national network can and should include really started to emerge. So the last 5 years has been incredibly interesting.
So I'm seeing some questions in the chat. We're going to get to you in just a moment. And I just want to give Melanie a chance to share about the US. And thanks for the shout out there, Ramesh. Over to you, Melanie. And you need to take it off mute.
Yes, my apologies. There's yard work happening outside, so it's a little loud. So a couple of things in context, and this is really sort of a 50,000 foot view, maybe even higher. But I want to talk just a little bit about the evolution of ACRO's thinking around the digital record landscape. So ACRO was founded in 1910. We're one of the oldest higher education associations in the US. We often say we are the oldest, but I'm not sure we can quite substantiate that. But we provide professional development, guidelines, and voluntary standards for higher education administrators, mainly in the records and enrollment areas. So we also do a lot of advocacy efforts for higher education institutions and for student success efforts and student access efforts. In terms of standards, we either set some voluntary standards or work with in collaboration with other organizations to socialize the ideas around standards, because it is standards that become the foundation of much of what we have to do to ease student mobility. This is really important in the US because we are so highly decentralized. Associations and organizations really do play a key role in making mobility happen for students and setting those standards. But again, I want to emphasize that they are voluntary standards. There are very few standards in the US that are required unless you start to get into things like what we call the regulated professions. And so talking about law, medicine, teaching, engineering, those sorts of things, which have some regulations at the state level, at the state board level, and then some coordinating quality assurance organizations. We do represent institutions of every level. And so we have large publics, small privates, community colleges. We have very, very large, and as just like Francisco, very small. I have two other notes to make. One is just a note in response to Romesh bringing up Lisbon. And I think that that's an important note in that that is a process that the US has been an observer to, but has really no legal framework to fully participate. And so we signed the Lisbon Convention, but there's no way to ratify the Lisbon Convention. We don't have that legal framework and have no ability to participate in policy, global policy level frameworks. The other piece I think that's important to the conversation is really about mobility in the US. The US education system has evolved in such a way that approximately 40% of the students enrolled in post-secondary education have attended more than one institution domestically. So mobility domestically is crucial. And I think a lot of the standard work that we have done has really been around this domestic mobility and the ease of access to institutions for students to enable domestic mobility. And we also host more than 1 million students from outside the US, and it's a sizable percentage of the globally mobile students. And so we do engage in that way and have an interest in being globally mobile and globally connected. So there are an enormous number of international student records and just student records moving throughout the country and across US institutions.
So one of the things I'm going to do now is I'm just going to stop the share so that we can get real here and ask a few more interesting questions. And Herman in our chat has gotten right to the chase, which I love. And he's really asking, okay, your 3 associations, you work within your borders doing wonderful things. There's lots of things you're doing across your borders. You know, how can we work together across borders and actually make this work so that we have true sustainable interoperability in the digitized world for our learners? And so what I want to do is kind of start with maybe Romesh to give us a flavor as to some ideas here if it's not happening now.
Sure. I mean, the first thing I'll say is that, you know, the conversations have started. amongst our three organizations, because we recognize that the time has come for not only interoperability, but general points of collaboration amongst our three registrars associations. I was struck by the fact that when we talk about mobility, generally that implies that students and or documents are moving from place to place. But in an age where, like many of you, I'm sitting here at home as opposed to even in my office, or our learners are sitting at home wherever home may be, as opposed to on campus in a classroom, we have a rise not only in academic programs and courses that are being delivered online, but literally a complete shift from where things had been last March to where things now are. So when we talk about mobility, if we had had this conversation a year ago, it would have meant something slightly different than what it now means. I think, with that in mind, how do we define mobility from the context of somebody in Guadalajara who is enrolled in an academic program at McGill, or vice versa, a McGill graduate who is seeking employment in Mexico City or in Tampa? At that stage, basically the general mobility tends to take on the flavor of the transfer of records of learning and the ubiquity of those records of learning and how they are ingested and interpreted and validated by that third party, so that that learner or that individual can then continue their journey and their trajectory wherever that wherever they are seeking to go.
So essentially, you're saying that we're in many ways, one of the big change enablers are people themselves. They're moving, and then we have to work hard to support that and make sure that it can be consumed in one format or another whenever it arrives at a destination.
Yeah, I mean, I guess the days of insularity are pretty much over, at least in my estimation. And this is basically where borders are, for the most part, artificial. And from a learner's perspective, I mean, certainly from a customer experience perspective, it should be a seamless flow and a seamless experience, basically, is transitioning from one arena to another. Three organizations such as ours, spanning North America, should not only be in conversation about what that can look like for our learners, but equally should be poised to put in place the necessary measures to make that seamless transition a reality.
So Francisco, how are you doing that in Mexico? Like your early days yet, you've innovated this wonderful environment that just is building the scaffolding out for you. How are you going to make this work across borders?
Okay, well, I think we have to work. We have a challenge between our three countries, maybe not just Mexico, by the way, for our three countries, to make our different systems and standards and communications compatible. I mean, the new model in Mexico since 2018 is very, very young. We don't have history. I mean, we don't have historic credentials, historic digital credentials. We just have new digital credentials from 2018 to now. And these credentials are in a very maybe popular, but maybe old standard like XML. And we have to work towards, I think, to make some things compatible between our three countries and with other regions of the world. So our students, our citizens can go out and their digital credentials can be useful for them. And citizens from other parts of the world can come here to North America, any of our three countries, and their digital credentials can be useful for them in any institution or in any job or for any job. So I think we have to work, Mexico, or obviously, but our three countries, in seeking this common ground, this common denominator about the standards, something that is feasible for the three of us. And this way we can serve our own citizens in this region and outside our region, maybe.
So I want to make sure that we're always doing a nod to our people in the chat. Is there any follow-up questions, or Rick, did you want to add a comment to this space?
Well, I think the one thing that's pretty clear, something with that Francisco has said, and what I hear Ramesh and Melanie talking about, is there's actually at least two different, I would say, student foci of this. One is the traditional learner, which Francisco, you're very focused on the traditional learner. And it really, going back to something we said earlier, how can we all get wrapped around the axle of enabling greater mobility in the traditional learning outcomes and portability among students that are still in school? Then you have the other lifelong learner that you need to add on to this, which are the adult learners that are getting reschooled, retooled, reskilled. And that is a much more complex and involved process. So going back to how do you get this to work, you have to figure out what ocean you're trying to boil and be able to, I think, get focused around, the traditional learner, and then you can put a whole effort around the lifelong learner, which has many more complexities. But I think, I think that's a great way to think about this, is to break this up.
It's interesting. Melanie, I know you want to make a comment. I'll let you do that. And then I have a follow-up question for you. Go ahead.
Oh, no, that's fine. I wanted to comment that at least in the US, we're really doing this work on two fronts. We have work to do in building this framework domestically, because we have to, I would say, socialize the idea, provide the resources, provide the tools, provide the standards and practices to get all institutions enabled to manage records digitally and to create this digital environment. And we're not there yet. We've had digital records in the US since the 80s, and we still have a significant number of institutions, which was illustrated by the pandemic, who are still not sending, or maybe they are sending a PDF, but they're not receiving records digitally. And so there's an enormous gap there that we have a lot of work to do in the US. But then between our three countries, I think that the place where this work is really beginning to happen on a collaborative basis, frankly, is GDN. The formation of GDN and the conversations that the network has enabled has allowed us to start to explore this space. And we're really just in the infancy. But I feel pretty hopeful that there's a lot of space to go. And I know we're going to talk about that later. But
yeah, so it's kind of interesting. All of you have talked about the learner, talked about the person that's walking somewhere, et cetera. There's a whole theory around user design theory. Collaboration is needing to also bring in the actual person, and that they're the one that's moving their document from A to Z, that they're the one that's going to that location. Any work any of you are doing that looks at how to bring the learner at the center, even in terms of the practice of the work you are doing? You want to go, Ramesh?
Sorry, I didn't hear I apologize. I didn't hear the question. I'm not sure if my audio is...
My question was, are you doing anything within the context of your work of collaboration that actually embeds bringing the learner to the table to help them as you're creating this universe for them to enable their movement? It's back to that user design theory. And I'm kind of putting you on the spot, but we have had consultation with learners, so it's a good example of that. Perhaps you could share some of that.
Sure, yeah, hopefully you can hear me now. Certainly within the Canadian context, right, the advent of the national network is meant to be a linchpin, essentially, for our learners to go view records of their own academic learning, and then to be able to share those records, with third parties, be they higher education institutions or beyond. I think I would echo what Melanie had mentioned. Certainly the things like EDI, or at least electronic records, have existed for a while, but in large part they were self-serving within the confines of higher ed. And that unfortunately did not include many of the other really important stakeholders that are in the sandbox with us, whether they be regulatory bodies, immigration authorities, licensure bureaus, financial industry, and banks, and so forth. These are all net consumers, as well as employers, that is, net consumers of many of these records of learning. And in an age of social medialization, such as we are in, recognition is much more at the forefront, and validation of that is much more at the fore than ever before. So for us, I think, you know, the common point, I guess, from a user centric type of experience, there's been a lot of discussion in other fora about the self-sovereignty of the learner and their ability to not only have access to those records of learning, but equally to share those in an appropriate and recognized way with other consumers. And I think that is a huge start. But in order to cement that basically in sort of the DNA of the learner, it implies that we've achieved a certain level of ubiquity with regard to those key stakeholders, so that they don't question it. I do get the odd question from time to time about the legitimacy of a 3-year degree from a Quebec-based university, or whether or not certain institutions who will remain nameless in the province of Quebec teach, you know, the language of instruction of those institutions is English. And these questions do come up, unfortunately, more frequently than I like to admit, and that generally means, to some extent, a certain lack of understanding across borders, or with other agencies who are trying to interpret the overall academic record that's in front of them.
So I know Melanie has a comment. I'm seeing a theme here that the credential evaluator, whether they sit within an agency, an institution, an organization, that credential evaluator that's looking at that individual learner's document, regardless of how it got there, digitization by mail or otherwise, helping to socialize and help them learn about the education systems and even the work that's going on, for example, that we learned from Francisco today. That's an important role that your organizations can play. Is that fair to say? Yeah. Melanie, did you want to make a comment?
Yeah, just a comment that I think what Romesh has said underscores this dual piece, in that in order to create true mobility and digital mobility, there's not only the technical infrastructure, but there's also the infrastructure of trust. Networks of trust are really key. And I think that that is some of the work that really we've been concentrating on, while the technical work has been happening as well. And until those networks of trust are really strengthened, the true idea around mobility isn't really going to be realized. The other word I wanted to throw out there, as we were talking about students, to bring it back to that question, is around the idea of student self-sovereignty. And that is a growing notion, at least within the US. And it's the beginnings of a shift in institutional philosophical approach to student records and to records exchange. As Romesh said, all of the digital infrastructure that's been done up to this point has been sort of self-serving, institution to institution. How do we make this easier for ourselves? And I think the philosophical shift that is rapidly occurring is around the idea that the student should be at the center of that. We all say we're student-centered and that we do our work for our students, but we actually are being pressed and asked to change the way that we work, the way that we are envisioning this network, in order to actually physically place the student at the center.
Would you also say that the diversity of privacy regulations, as well as the greater shift towards user-focused privacy regulations, is an imperative for institutions and organizations like yours to shift to a more self-sovereign model? Francisco, did you want to dive in and take that one?
Yes, definitely, Joan. I think our regulations, privacy regulations, are not too different. Maybe. I mean, I don't know USA and Canada privacy regulations, but I think they are all very similar. But definitely, privacy regulations are key for self sovereignty, as Melanie said, and maybe it has to help us to build this trust that Melanie said just a few moments. I think, at least in Mexico, everything is about policy, and everything is regulated. So we need this trust, as Melanie said, and we have to release all these regulations. We have to be flexible in all these regulations, so we can put in the center of our activity the learner, not just the student, but the learner, the lifelong learner, the students and adults. So yes, I think privacy regulations are key, but I think we are very similar in this topic. I don't know if Melanie and Ramesh have something to say about it.
You want to go ahead, Ramesh?
Sure. I mean, I'll say this much: our privacy legislation is at the heart of what we do in the registrar community. There's no doubt about it. The more recent legislation that's come out globally, to wit, the GDPR as a classic example, as well as the notion of the right to be forgotten. I mean, these are sort of key concepts that have sort of hit our industry just in the last couple of years that, in many ways are reshaping the way we do business, and allowing us or making us rethink how we present information, how we engage with organizations or with individuals about any element of the student record. So as much as, I mean, this is kind of the tension, right? The healthy tension between sharing versus sharing too much or with the wrong people. As we move into more easily transportable artifacts of learning, we need to keep them secure. We need to make sure that they're being channeled to the right people and in a self-directed manner by the learner.
So one of the things that before we go back to Rick to look at the context of sustainable interoperability, I kind of want to throw a question out to you and to our audience. Here we have 3 significant organizations doing some very important things. What more is needed to achieve the art of the possible when we're talking about sustainable interoperability? What are we missing? What other things do we need to focus on? Go ahead, Melanie.
My gut first reaction to what more is needed is frankly urgency.
Urgency.
Yes. I really.
That's interesting.
It seems to me that the events of the pandemic have highlighted the challenges that we have in this space. It's highlighted where our gaps are. It's highlighted the inequities across the systems, and highlighted really where we're losing our students and okay. where that's breaking down. And so that's, for me, urgency is really, really the key. I think the players are here, but we need a little bit more urgency and maybe a little more coordination.
I hear you. Yes. Francisco, go ahead. You're on mute.
Thank you, Joan. I think what more is needed? For me, willingness, just willingness, and maybe some creativity. And I mean willingness not only from our 3 associations. I grant it, our willingness, obviously, but willingness from our governments, our authorities, our legal framework. I mean, we can do many things with the student in the center or the learner in the center of our activity. But sadly, I can see the education is not a priority in our countries, at least not in Mexico. I don't know in USA and Canada, but at least in Mexico, education is not priority. And certainly not higher education. So what more is needed? Willingness, just political willingness and creativity from us, our associations, our institutions. And with these two ingredients, maybe we can achieve many more things in no time, as Melanie said, with in an urgent manner.
So we've got urgency, willingness, creativity. We've heard the word trust. We've heard the word information to help people understand what's going on, and collaboration. Anything else, Ramesh, before I hand it over to Rick?
The only other thing, I would echo what's been said, but the only other thing I can think of would be a framework. When my wife says in a very loving tone, we need to talk, it can mean a number of things. But what first comes to mind are, what are we talking about? For how long are we talking about it? What are the rules of engagement here so that we can build something in a productive way, and ideally in a romantic way too. But jokes aside, I think a framework for conversation takes it from the esoteric to the concrete. I think we have certainly talked in general at an esoteric level about the needs for collaboration and for for moving forward on these things. But the framework and potentially even building out sort of the key building blocks for what we're seeking to achieve. That's where the magic happens.
So I'm hearing principle-based shared framework to help guide sustainable interoperability, which is a space where organizations like the GDN and TISAP and so on can help. Over to you, Rick, for some closing thoughts.
Yeah, if I can just add one extra piece, the PESC itself is playing an exceptional role in that regard. I mean, I can't say enough about how great the conversations have been at PESC. That is an operational group, a standards-based organization that's doing tremendous work and is helping shepherd things along. Sorry, Rick.
No, that's okay.
Go ahead, Rick.
So I agree with everything that's been said, but I am going to add one more dimension, and this will not be a shock to anyone. Data. You need to be able to have the data that actually supports the case. Why a government should allocate more funding, right, to support interoperability. Why states should care about this, and what's the mutual benefit by province, by state, right, by supporting these efforts and the mobility of learners across state borders, provincial borders, as well as national borders. In Europe, we were part of this graduate tracking study. Well, why? Because Europeans are trying to figure out what the value add is. There is this ideological assessment of what it is, and some of it's negative. Well, how do you debunk the myth about the positive impact of mobility? You need information and data. So I would say that we also have to anchor our efforts with a real focus on goals that I'd say, and this is the impact we expect to have. And I think the coalitions and everything that we've talked about can then also improve, with some beacons and some KPIs that they're going to be looking to add to the equation as well. But I think,
so what I'm hearing, sorry, go ahead.
We're at the beginning of a process, and and thank you, Joanne, for the opportunity to comment here.
Yes, and I think what I'm hearing from all of you is we have to make clear what the return on investment is. We have to remember who we're doing it for, which is our learner. And we also need to be thinking about the how, back to how do we make it work. So we want to thank everybody for joining the conversation today. These are our emails if people want to carry the dialogue further. It's been an absolute pleasure. And to the Groningen Declaration Network, thank you for providing this convening opportunity. And I'll pause there.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you to the participants. Thank you to the participants.
Yeah.
I saw there Kathleen, Herman, and some other friends.
Pleasure speaking with all of you. Take care, stay healthy.
Thanks, everyone. Be well.